Hi there, I'm Stephanie, and this is Headlines and Tidbits, the podcast that brings the forgotten, the bizarre, and the downright unbelievable back to life from the dusty corners of old newspapers. Each episode is split into two parts. First, I'll share a headline that caught my eye. It could be something strange, unsettling, or just too odd to ignore. And I'll walk you through the story behind it, who it involved, what happened, and why it matters. Then I'll take you through some of my favorite tidbits, little gems from the past, scandalous divorce notices, eyebrow-raising ads, oddball local stories, the kind of things that never made the history books, but still tell us about the world we came from. So today's story, we're going to start with the Omaha Morning Bee, and they reported on December 10th, 1935, about a terrifying event that happened in Omaha. The headline reads, "Slayer uses children's play rope to end lives." So with that awful headline, we are diving into the story of family annihilator Charles Cobb. He was a Nebraska man who in 1935 did the unthinkable. He took the lives of his entire family, his wife, his children, even the family dog, before taking his own. It's the kind of headline that once shocked a community and then slowly faded into the past. But today, we're bringing it back, not for shock value, but to understand how a tragedy like this could happen and what it says about the pressures families were facing during some of the hardest years in American history. And sadly, we still have these crimes happening today. So setting the stage, it's Nebraska, 1935. America was deep in the Great Depression. Unemployment was high, banks had failed, families were barely scraping by. In rural communities like those in Nebraska, the burden was especially heavy. Charles Cobb was one of many men struggling to hold his family together in a time where the world felt like it was falling apart. Charles was born on November 15th, 1894 in Chicago. He married Rosa Anderson at some point, I'm not sure exactly when. Rosa was born in 1895 in Nebraska. Charles and Rose went on to have two little boys, Robert, aka Bobby, and Charles Jr., who they called Chubby. So just a quick side note, the 1930s, they were a devastating time for many American families. The pressure to provide, especially from men, was enormous, and the social stigma around failure, mental illness, or needing help kept many from seeking support. Charles lived with his wife and children in a modest home. He was a father, a husband, and to neighbors, probably just another working man doing the best he could. In 1935, he had worked for Western Union for 19 years. But behind closed doors, something was unraveling. Then, during the late evening of Sunday, December 8th, 1935, something broke. Charles sat in the living room of his home and wrote an 8-page letter to his friends Clarence and Hazel Olson, explaining why he was planning on killing his family and himself. Next to him was a table that held a Bible his mother gave him, the birth announcement of his son Charles, and an ashtray that apparently held 35 cigarette butts. Here is the first part of that letter. Dear Clarence and Hazel, this will probably be a shock to you both. I am sitting here in the living room, perfectly calm, in my right mind, and in a short time I plan to do a most horrible thing, in the viewpoint of the modern social age. I am going to take the lives of those most dear to me, in as painless a manner as possible, for the following reasons, which in the minds of most persons would be very trivial, but which have magnified themselves in my mind until I find them insufferable. First, the lack of money, because of debts contracted to provide a reasonable services over our obligations to give us the everyday things we seem to need. No one is to blame but ourselves. But now, because we owe every cent of our pay before it is received, we find the lack of a few dollars have caused a great deal of hard feelings between Rose and myself. The fact we can't have things we need, etc., has been the source of most of our petty squabbles. No one but we two can be blamed for our improvident manner of living. All this is trivial and could in time be corrected, but it would involve a change in our characters we seem to be incapable of achieving. After he wrote the letter, he went upstairs to the bedroom he shared with his wife Rose and shot her with a shotgun while she slept. He then went to his son Robert's room and strangled him. After that, he went to his youngest son Charles' room and strangled him as well. After he killed his family, he went back downstairs and wrote another note that said, quote, Rose went to sleep first, then Bob, and last Chubby. He then put both notes on the mantel of the fireplace. Charles took the vacuum hose and his Cocker Spaniel, Lady or Lassie, the dog's name is reported differently, and he got into his car and left the home. He drove to a nearby lake called Nathan's Lake and parked beside a quiet haystack. There, he attached the hose to the car's exhaust pipe and threaded the other end through a window, sealing it with a blanket to trap the fumes. Then he climbed into the front seat, leaned back, crossed his hands, and closed his eyes. As the engine hummed, Charles waited until death took him and his dog. So, quick note, I just want to talk about how crimes like this and people like Charles fall into a category known as family annihilators. And it's a rare but deeply disturbing phenomenon in which a person, and most often a man, murder their entire family before killing themselves. These crimes are usually premeditated and are often tied to feelings of despair, loss of control, or a distorted sense of protection. One of the most recent family annihilators that I can think of is Chris Watts. Now, he did not kill himself, but he wanted out of his marriage. He was having an affair. And instead of just getting a divorce, he chose to annihilate his entire family. I just kind of wanted to touch on that briefly, but back to our story. The next morning, a local farmer, H.E. Boyd, and his daughter, Jane, saw the car parked on the side of the road and decided to stop and investigate. They quickly saw Cobb and Lady. And so when Cobb was discovered in his car, he was wearing a gray cap, corduroy trousers, a leather jacket, brown shoes, and brown striped socks. Next to him was an empty bottle of gin. The car was still running, so Boyd reached in the car and turned off the ignition and disconnected the hose from the exhaust pipe. He then called the sheriff, and once the authorities arrived at the site, they quickly identified Charles and sent officers to check on the family home. So 2 police officers and a reporter, Russell Reese, showed up to the family home. The house was all locked up, so they had to break into the home. They got into the home by boosting the reporter through an open second-floor window. And it just makes me laugh. They put the reporter in there. They don't know what they're walking into, and we know, obviously, they are walking into a crime scene, but they just throw the reporter into the window. So 1930s, I guess. Once Russell was in the bedroom, he yelled down to the police, "Here's the boy." When everybody got into the house and they found Rose, she was in bed and wearing what they described as a dress, which I'm kind of guessing is more like a nightgown. And apparently the covers were pulled up to her chin and her hands were folded over her chest. The authorities assumed that Charles did that after he killed her. One sad note that I picked up on was the police had noticed that Rose had laid out her husband's pajamas and clothes, which is kind of sad. It's her doing one little sweet thing for him while he was up before she went to bed. And sadly, this happened. But now the oldest son, Robert, was found in his bedroom, and there were clearly marks of strangulation on his neck. And the younger son, Charles, was found in his room as well. He was on his side, and they described the body as being in a position that a young boy would sleep in. There were no marks on his body that they could immediately see, though. And downstairs, they saw where Charles had left the letters he wrote, but they also noticed that next to the ashtray, there was a small vial of clear liquid. They thought that maybe it was poison or chloroform. They also saw the shotgun, which had been taken apart in the living room. In the basement, police discovered what they believed had been used to kill the 2 boys. It was their own play rope. This was the rope that the boys used to practice rodeo tricks. Part of the rope was actually charred, suggesting it had been burned recently. And I'm not exactly sure how investigators determined that this was what Charles used. Perhaps some of it was found in the boys' bedrooms, but the autopsy did confirm that all 3 family members had been strangled. Later on, one of the neighborhood boys told the police that they used the rope to practice Will Rogers tricks. So that's pretty sad if that's really what Charles used to commit these murders. I mean, I guess it doesn't matter what he uses, but your kid's toy, it's just so crazy. Rose had also been shot, and authorities believed she may have fought back during the attack, possibly when Charles was trying to strangle her. And when Charles couldn't overpower her, they suspect he pulled out a gun and shot her. In the dining room, they found a piece of paper which Rose used to write out the family's budget for the month of December, and here is what was listed. $36 for payment on the car, $25 for rent, $13 for paint, $4 for milk, and $13 for coal. The total was $111, and at the bottom of one sheet was a notation, $12 to spend. The authorities started inspecting the rest of the house and talking to neighbors. And some of the neighbors said they were suspecting that something was wrong because 2 bottles of milk were left outside on the porch and the family's cat was upset and hungry. One neighbor told police that he had seen Charles putting up storm windows that Saturday afternoon. So the police also spoke with the Olsons. This was the couple who Charles wrote his letter to. The Olsons were good family friends with the Cobb family. The Olsons told the police that they never suspected anything was wrong. Miss Olson even said that Charles and Rose were a, quote, unusually devoted couple. And Charles' coworkers said that he was a quiet but cheerful man. They were in shock over what he had done. So the coroner determined that each family member was chloroformed before he strangled them. And the coroner also estimated that it probably took Charles about 30 minutes to kill all three of his family members. So if you think back to what the police found next to the chair in the living room, that clear liquid kind of makes you wonder if that's what it was. So now I'd like to go back to the 8-page letter that Charles wrote. At the beginning of the episode, I talked about the very beginning of the letter, but let's dive into the rest. His reasoning for the killings was debt, failure, and shame. He blamed the crushing weight of financial pressure, bills they couldn't pay, obligations piling up, and his own failings at work. Cobb had neglected duties at his job, missed turning in reports, and feared that he would soon be fired. He said in his letter that he wasn't, quote, man enough to take the consequences. In the letter, he also listed their debts in great detail. He talked about loans, unpaid furniture, money owed to friends, bills for coal, shoes, the dentist. And he even listed random amounts like $175 here, $300 there. Then he turned to life insurance. Cobb believed that if he killed only himself, Rose would be left with about $4,000. And in his mind, that was not enough for her to survive. So this was kind of a justification, and he convinced himself that it would be worse for her to struggle than to die. And in his words, he said, quote, my own suicide would only complicate matters worse for Rose. So he just decides this for her. He wants out, obviously, and he just determines that life would be too hard without him. And he chooses to take his wife and children's life. It's just unbelievable. So in his letter, he had also appointed a friend as executor, and he gave away his fishing tackle and said that he had no close relatives left. He asked that if possible, he be buried quietly, but if money was short, to cremate them all and scatter their ashes. What stands out most is that Cobb never once questioned whether he should do this, only how. And in fact, he wrote, quote, you and others cannot be expected to forgive my twisted reasoning, but I have convinced myself and I am justified in taking this step. And then perhaps the most haunting line of his letter is, quote, I am going to drive my car to some secluded spot near town and end my own life by carbon monoxide poisoning. I am a rational man and cold sober. So he ended the letter with a plea. He said, quote, think as kindly of me as you can. Keep a spot in your heart for Rose and the boys. They deserve it even if I don't. Signed, Charles A. Cobb. So now, when Omaha psychiatrist Dr. George E. Newhouse examined the letter, he reached a much darker conclusion. According to him, Cobb was not thinking clearly at all, which I completely agree. He wasn't calm, logical, or rational. In fact, the doctor said that he was delusional. Newhouse said Cobb suffered from grandiose delusions, a distorted belief that he was the Lord and master of creation. Cobb twisted facts to justify what he was about to do. He imagined himself believing that he had the right to end lives as if he were God. The psychiatrist pointed to one line in particular that Cobb wrote, and it says, my own suicide would only complicate matters worse for Rose. I have only $5,000 in insurance, on which I have borrowed. She would have only about $4,000 left. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. He just assumes that she can't live without him. Newhouse called that absurd. He said any woman could survive on $4,000 for a time, especially with time to work and earn her own money. Cobb's reasoning was not just irrational, it was delusional. He wasn't trying to protect his family. He had already decided what was best for them. He played judge, jury, and executioner. Newhouse said Cobb likely saw death as a performance, not something private, but something lonely and dramatic. That's why he left the house to die. He didn't want to simply sit in the garage and turn on the car. He wanted a scene, something poetic. He even took the dog with him. The most chilling detail, according to Dr. Newhouse, was the method of how he killed them, strangulation. He said it's one of the most painful ways to kill, and yet Cobb did it over and over again. Newhouse said it's difficult to understand how after having killed one, he could repeat the performance again and again. And in the end, Cobb believed that he made the right choice, but Dr. Newhouse didn't agree. He said, quote, no sane man could have done what Charles Cobb did. So news of the killings rocked the local community. Headlines described the grisly scene. Some papers referred to Cobb as a man who snapped. But even then, there was little language or understanding for mental illness or the trauma or the emotional toll of poverty that the family was probably going through, particularly Charles. And of course, there's no trial, there's no confession, and really questions that couldn't be answered. Questions like, why didn't anyone see it coming? Was there a final breaking point? What despair must he have felt? Now, one interesting event did happen 5 years later. In fact, almost to the date of the murders, the family home mysteriously burned to the ground. So today, when we look back at Charles Cobb's story, it's easy to focus on the scary part of the story. But it's also a window into a time when people were suffering in silence, when help was hard to find, and when the weight of the world could sit so heavily on one man's shoulder that he believed there was no other way out. Not to say that today is perfect by any means, but I think it's a little bit more acceptable for people to reach out and ask for help, to see a therapist, to address their mental illness. And this isn't a story with a lesson or a twist. It's a dark headline from a dark time, but it's worth remembering because behind every headline, there's a family, a home, a history, and a moment where everything changed. And that is the sad, tragic story of the Cobb family. So now for the tidbits portion of the episode. And we actually just have one tidbit today, and it is a short little story titled Dressed as She Should Be, and it's from 1921. And I'll post this photo up. The photo is really cute if you're just listening on audio. It's a 1921 kind of flapper-looking girl. She's got shorter hair, a bonnet, and a skirt on. I guess not really a flapper, but she's just kind of got the bob of a flapper. So it reads, when the pretty and amusing flapper is dressed as she should be, she has a charm of her own. Usually this young person is opinionated and would like to array herself in more or less startling, not to say vampish, appeal. The gentle art of dressing appropriately is more often a matter of education than of natural good taste. As a rule, very young girls at present are overdressed, and by just so much as they are overdressed, they are losers in appeal and charm. This is less true of the daughters of families that have had generations of money and position than of the newly prosperous. Certain high-class schools throughout the country dictate to their students in matters of dress for several good reasons. In this picture above, we have the portrait of a miss of 16 or thereabouts, dressed as an authority in the matter of dress for school or whatever occupies her day. Her skirt of soft wool in two quiet contrasting stripes is laid in wide but not deep plaits. It is worn with an overblouse in the same color as the dark stripe in the skirt made of a knitted wool or fiber silk, and open at the throat, where a chamisette and collar of lace enable her to keep this little outfit fresh and dainty. Her shoes, high or low according to the climate, are substantial, with broad heels, and her hat is a soft affair of cloth covered with braided design. I just thought that was kind of interesting and a little glimpse into the way that women dressed back in the day. So, well, I hope you enjoyed exploring these headlines and tidbits with me, and I hope you come back to listen to stories from newspapers of the past. See you next time.